Ubuntu. It's a Nguni Bantu word that became sort of known in the US more through the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa. This word Ubuntu, which means I am because we are, or a person is a person through other people. So maybe now would be a good time to talk a little bit about my own personal story and why it is that I come to this work. So I am a survivor of sexual violence, particularly child sexual abuse and rape and sexual assault at various times in my life. But the sort of primary harm that I've spent the most amount of time thinking about is the child sexual abuse I endured in my home, that my father sexually abused me. And when I first read this word and understood its definition, Ubuntu, I really understood it in the context of my own family, right? Like a person is a person through other people. Nothing could have been more true to me as a child survivor of sexual abuse, who's deeply influenced in both wonderful and terrible ways by my father, and whose my father's impact on my life has been both wonderful and terrible. And I literally, because I am his child, and particularly his biological child, I literally exist because he existed. And so that, I think, was always a deep challenge for me in early in my time. Sort of, he passed away when I was 16, and shortly thereafter, this was in the 1980s, I got deeply involved in movements to end sexual and intimate partner violence. Back then, I think we called things like the battered women's movement. And but I really sort of also felt this deep conflict because I wasn't interested in what was on offer and what was growing at that time in the connection between, Violence Against Women Act, all of these things that were really making criminalization the primary response, and separation, shelters. And as I say this, I want it to be really clear that I am in no way intending to devalue the incredible work that advocates do in the current system as it operates. I see that there is need for these things. I think we need to reimagine how they might be more beneficial. And I think that they are under-resourced even to do what they set out to do in a way that could be beneficial at the scale that is needed, given the ubiquity of harms like child sexual abuse and domestic violence and rape and all forms of sexual violence. So from my side, it never occurred to me to contact the system because I didn't want my father to be locked up or taken away. I didn't want, the involvement of Child Protective Services. I was growing up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania where, we were the only people, only immigrants. I was the only child of color in my school. I didn't want to be put in a home where nobody spoke my language or ate our food or practiced our religion, and I didn't want to be taken away from my mother and my sister, who was my lifeline, my best friend, and my true advocate, as much as was possible under the circumstances that we were in. And so, to my mind, really, it's interesting looking back and seeing that when I moved into the realm of working to end sexual and intimate partner violence in my early 20s, I started to move towards advocating for things that I myself never chose to participate in, or had they been on offer when I was younger, I wouldn't have opted for them, right? So I started to look to my own religious and spiritual roots, and became interested in the Tibetan system of justice prior to Chinese occupation. And I learned a lot about alternative ways, or I shouldn't call it alternative, ways that people do things that made a lot more sense to me. And in that process, I learned about this concept of Indrasnet. So Indrasnet, this is an old depiction of it. In the next slide, I'll show you sort of a new artist's rendering of it. But the idea of Indrasnet is that the universe is a infinite interconnected web. And a multidimensional interconnected web. And at every juncture, at every single place where two strands meet, there is a gemstone. And that gemstone is infinitely faceted. This is the nature of the universe. And each facet of the stone reflects in each stone every other stone this infinite web is reflected, because each stone has an infinite number of facets. So I don't know if that's easy to see or understand. It's challenging in these ancient two-dimensional depictions and drawings. But what is so beautiful to me about this one in particular, and I want to learn more about it, is that it's got this thing in the middle that has 4 quadrants that look very much like indigenous medicine wheels that I've also been learning more about. So I'm very curious about the connection of this these 4 pieces, and learning what its relationship is really to this infinite web. When I think about things today that we're learning more about through the environmental movement, right? That there is a way that we can throw, for example, a plastic bottle, right? Nothing is truly trash. It's going to end up in our landfills, and then in our water, in our particulate matter, in our air. It's going to end up in our oceans. And I feel the same way about the criminal legal system. We can't send people away. They are coming home. And regardless, particularly around sexual violence, and I know that many people on this webinar know this, that we're simply relocating it inside, right? Given the high rates of sexual violence inside facilities. In a sense, in the same way that plastic becomes particulate matter in our water and our air, we're still breathing each other's stories. We can't send anyone away. And I feel this really on a deep, deep level. And I think that that's ultimately what draws me to restorative justice as a potential way to heal these harms. This is the digitally recreated notion of Indrasnet, where there's this sense, this effort, I think, to have every single, for folks on the phone, I'm just showing these images, to have every single thing in the universe reflected back in every single other thing in this infinite web. I find this image quite moving. And so that's a heavy burden, in a sense, for us to carry, right? If I am reflecting everything, sometimes that makes me also want to run far, far, far away. And so for those of us who do work in restorative justice, and while we were watching all those words scroll by earlier, I think it's really, really important to center our own wellness and our own self-care. I think people are using better words for that now. That there's something almost to, self-care, a beautiful word, self and care. And yet there's some way in which even that, there's a way that we could frame it that's deeply interconnected, and that the individualism of that can be eroded because we're not individuals in that sense. And so, and that how well we are attending to ourselves impacts the work, and definitely impacts our work as restorative justice facilitators. So a little bit more about honoring the roots of where these things come from. I think it's incredibly important to note that nobody owns restorative justice, right? It is not something that any one person came up with. While Howard Zehr is sort of often credited with coming up with these words, and I think he's done a beautiful job of helping define what these terms are in ways that the secular Western mind can grab a hold of. There are also many, many other teachers. And my teachers sort of in order start with Tibetan and Mennonite teachers, but I've learned so much from Dene, the Navajo people, Maori teachers and practitioners in Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand, and many, many others, right? So if you look far enough, again, I already said this, but if you look far enough back in all of our roots, we will see the roots of restorative justice there. This notion of making efforts to make amends being a really important part of things, having community and family support for those directly impacted to move to a state of moving forward in a good way. So because many of these things come from indigenous or other faith or spiritual backgrounds, I think it's really, really important to avoid appropriation, right? And so one of the ways that we can do that is to, as we learn different types of peacemaking, et cetera, family group conferencing, things that come from other people in other ways than our own faith and historical journeys, and especially important for us to feel like we can receive these things from others, particularly for those of us who are dissociated from our own historical roots, right? I mean, it is an incredible privilege to know things about where we come from, as encumbered as those things may be for some of us. And so this process of receiving permission and understanding what it is that when we learn things before we go out and do them or teach them or share them, and understanding that that is sort of the first step towards avoiding appropriation feels very, very important. And we didn't say at the beginning, and I just want to say too that there's going to be time for question and answer at the end. So I know I'm saying a lot of things and they have a lot of juicy content in them. And so I just want to name that there will surely be time for Q&A at the end. So another thing that I think is really important to understand in restorative justice processes, there's something quite unique about the models that I have been trained in and the approaches that I've been trained in. And it's that we don't do sort of team approaches. Rather, a single set of co-facilitators work with everyone impacted, the person harmed, the person who's responsible, with the community members, and that we are not playing shuttle mediator. And we're not the deciders or the decision makers in any way as the facilitators or circle keepers of these processes, but rather our work is to create a safe container for people who've been harmed, people who are responsible, and the community to come together to answer those questions. Who's been harmed? What do they need? Whose obligation is it to meet those needs? What's the process that we're going to do this? Who has a stake? What are the causes? All of these things get created by this group collectively with the assistance of the person holding space. So rather than, so what I learned in law school and people who do mediation, right, is that we're neutral arbiters or neutral mediators. And to be clear, there is no part of my heart that is ever neutral, especially in the more severe harms that I think about and have the honor of occasionally holding processes for. And that rather that my orientation is equal partiality. And that really ties back beautifully to that quote by Dr. King, right? Like, I can never be who I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. I am invested in you being who you ought to be. I am partial to you being who you are meant to be. And, it really starts from a fundamental belief that we are all beautiful beings and we all are capable of improvement. We are all capable of some level of accountability when properly supported to do that. And so it is really this heart of total partiality towards all people all the time, as much as possible, right? So am I perfect at that? Absolutely not, right? Are there times when I feel this feeling of sides popping up in me? Sure. That might be particularly so when it's somebody very close to me who's been harmed, right? I am working on being someone who sort of moves beyond that as well. But, and I think that relates in some ways to who should be the facilitator of a process, right? If I feel like I'm not capable of equal partiality, then I don't know that I'm going to be the best facilitator for a restorative justice process. So that being said, that doesn't mean that I wouldn't participate in a process where I know the parties well. There are times when I have known the person who's caused the harm and the person who's experienced the harm and known the community and known all the people in the community. And I don't think that disqualifies me in the same way that in the legal system, we recuse ourselves if we are too close to the issue, either personally or actually knowing the folks. And particularly my Navajo teachers have said that that's literally the opposite of the way they would do things, that no one would be qualified to hold space if they weren't deeply knowledgeable about the parties, right? The question is equal partiality, not lack of knowledge. Deep knowledge with equal partiality might make for the best facilitator. That's not always possible, especially when we're having restorative justice programs where people don't know people necessarily who, like, there might be a community-based organization where there's restorative justice facilitators on offer. Sometimes when that community-based organization is embedded in the community in which the harm's happening, they will know the people who are involved, and sometimes they won't. But anyway, so this is sort of the standard that we're kind of trying to go for, this equal partiality, not neutrality standard. And so there are many, many ways in which this can happen. At Impact Justice, we work particularly with two models, circle process and circles and restorative community conferencing. And so circles can take many, many different, there's so many different forms. We learned from Kay Pranis, I learned from Kay Pranis, and many of the people at Impact Justice come from other organizations where the original line of sort of information came from Cape Pranish, who learned from the people of the Yukon as well as from Plains Indians, and sort of was given permission by many indigenous people that she learned from to share what she had been taught, and to actually alter things in some ways in order to be beneficial to communities that are not embedded in indigenous values, right? And so she's done an excellent job of creating the circle process that has exercises where we can help create, for the purpose of this circle, for the purpose of this community, for as long as it's going to last together, a set of shared values that we're going to operate in relationship to. Another model that I find very interesting and lots to learn from there are peacemaking circles from various indigenous communities. And the other model we work in is restorative community conferencing, which comes from Aotearoa, from the Maori folks. The family group conferencing model that they use there was secularized to some degree by the New Zealand government, and made the way in which all youth wrongdoing is addressed as a matter of course. Restorative justice through family group conferencing is the way in which youthful wrongdoing is addressed. And my team at Impact Justice is doing an amazing job rolling out community approaches to addressing youthful wrongdoing, particularly felonies and other types of harm, through restorative community conferencing. But I think that it's also a model that we should be thinking about in relationship to intimate partner and sexual violence. We are just at the beginnings of starting to explore how we might do that in a good and a safe way. I think that the major difference that I would state now in relationship to the work that I am starting to get involved in Richmond, California, and in other places around restorative approaches to intimate partner and sexual violence, is that the standard sort of diversion model may not be ideal. We know that 50% of survivors don't contact the system at all. And of those who do, 20% say it made them less safe. I got that information from B. Hansen when I was at a roundtable for restorative justice in New Mexico about 8 years ago. So this is outdated data. I'm not sure. After all that we know that's been going on with ICE and continued increased fear of contacting the system, that those numbers may be worse. They may be better. It's hard to know. That was information that you could get from the federal government under the last administration, but not under this one. So I think it's really important to consider, that off-the-grid approaches to addressing intimate partner and sexual violence, right? That people shouldn't have to call the police in order to be sent to someone who will tell them the restorative justice is available, but rather that they should be able to walk into community-based organizations from jump and say, I need help. I'm in this relationship where we're experiencing violence, or I need help. My boyfriend sexually assaulted me and I want to have a dialogue with him. I want to figure out how to do this through restorative justice, and be able to receive that as a first step, as a first matter of course. So just some stories about what that looks like. And I think I'll just give you sort of the highest levels of what that looks like, right? It's thinking about teen dating violence. I think one of the things that was most moving to me in the handful of these cases that I got to do was that every young person who caused harm in teen dating violence situations, and some of those were coextensive with sexual violence, said at one point some version of these words: help me not be like my father, right? That all of these young people who are causing sexual harm and particularly teen dating violence were living in a home in which there was, or living in a family in which they grew up observing this. And I think that that's one of the most important takeaways from my experience in those cases. And then I think that it got sent out in events. I think Chelsea sent out this article in Vox 2018. I wrote a piece called, and Chelsea has just put it in the chat thing. It's a piece where I tell a story about a case that I facilitated in the sexual harm context. So I think several of you have probably read that at this point. And that was a really, really powerful case. And again, I'm just trying to be mindful of time. And so I'm going to let folks read that in their own time. And I really think that I told the story there in a very thorough way. My big takeaways from that case in particular was the power of watching a young woman say, it was a ninth grader who was sexually assaulted by a 12th grader who she had been friends with. And there was some potential, not sure exactly what the extent of their connection was prior to this, but he did ultimately sexually assault her. And she initially didn't want to, she initially was nervous about being in the room, but then changed her mind and wanted to be there, but decided she wanted her mother to be the person who communicated directly about the harm that she experienced. And she'd sort of written it all out, and we'd done a lot of prep work to prepare her for being in the discussion. And when she saw his face in the circle, she sort of took over and really told him a thing or two about what no means no means, and really wanted to get to the roots of where his behavior came from. And it was the most powerful conversation I have ever witnessed about the roots of sexual harm, and the roots in his own life and in his own miseducation about gender and sexuality, and about what it takes for people to make it right, and what was really desired by the person who experienced harm, and what it meant for her to be supported to name it in front of him and in front of her family and his family, and ultimately seeing the women in his family really empathizing with the person that, that their son, their brother had harmed, and ultimately working together to move forward in a good way. It was really, really powerful. And I walked away from that particular dialogue conference circle feeling like this, if we can find a way to make this available. When I think about my first meeting with that young man and my first meeting with that young woman, that were separate, right? They're separate. There's significant amounts of preparatory work on both sides. And myself and my co-facilitator were meeting with both separately. And then ultimately we all came together. And when I think about the transformation that happened through those preparatory sessions, but the real power came from the time that we were in the circle together, where everyone had been prepped and everyone knew, that they were going to be held by us to be able to have the conversation that they need to have. I walked away with a true belief that this is a way that we could handle some pretty serious cases of sexual harm. So just really briefly, I want to mention that there's been quite a bit of historical opposition to using restorative justice with intimate partner and sexual violence. And I think that it's important to name the fears and to hold the legitimacy of those fears, right? So people have expressed these kinds of fears, that survivors, I should say, will lack agency and safety in restorative processes, right? And I have seen restorative justice programs and processes who have not taken, who have pressured survivors to participate, who have an orientation towards folks who've caused harm without having enough knowledge about the underlying impact of sexual violence, about just wanting to see, and I want to understand it and honor it, that we don't want to see people go to prison, et cetera, but at the same time, running with that agenda at the expense of crime survivors. And so I think that it's important to name that this is a fear, right? That if we hold up restorative justice as good and right, then people may be pressured into dialogues, that people may be rushed to a process, particularly if it's operating in tandem with the state, where there's like a deadline by which the thing needs to happen. And so then how do we do that in a way that doesn't risk agency and safety on the part of survivors, right? So I think that these are important fears to name. Another fear has been that restorative justice will return things like intimate partner violence and sexual violence to the private sphere, right? Like there was a ton of work done in the 70s and 80s for people to say, like, this is a thing that actually happens, and you did treat an assault or a harm that happens in a home, or that is something that is, by nature, something that we're afraid to bring out into the open, like sexual violence, that there are consequences for bringing it out, that it has stayed in the private sphere for those reasons. And so making things a crime was a part of how it got acknowledged sort of in the national public consciousness. And so I get that. And I think it's really important for us to remember that restorative justice is not private. It is not, it should be confidential, right? But it shouldn't be it shouldn't be returning things to a place of secrecy. That is so important to name. that actually having family and community have a very, in the circle itself, a very open dialogue is actually bringing things out of the secrecies and shadow that usually accompany these harms. So restorative justice, the last fear is that restorative justice will undermine certain feminist theories on the causes of violence against women. And so I remember when I first got involved in restorative justice, in work to end intimate partner and sexual violence. And I was told very clearly that men abuse because they can. And this was the trainings that I received over and over. And I know we've made some headway since then, right? That it's not that simple. And that the patriarchy means that men are abusive really was some stuff that we were saying in a pretty intense and rigid way in the late 80s and early 90s, right? But I think that this notion that people can and will change is something that was really lacking at the inception of our work. And it is something that like even Batter's intervention programs were seen as, like futile because they were expecting something that was impossible. But then that problem was solved by telling people who go to these kinds of programs to unlearn the patriarchy, that if you're told you do this because you can and that this is inherent to your being, that you will cause sexual harm, that you will cause intimate partner violence, that you will do these things because that's when you have to just like fight your inner nature as a person of your gender. I don't really think that that's going to get us across the finish line in terms of a world in which we are free of these kinds of harms, right? I fundamentally don't believe that. So I don't believe that about any of the men that I have ever met, including people who are locked up for the rest of their lives for having done unthinkable levels of sexual violence. I believe that there is a possibility for change in all of us. So I just need to name some of those fears that I think people express. There might be a million more. And I think we need to attend to them, right? Like it's not like we jump on the restorative justice bandwagon and then all of a sudden all of these things aren't true. They may be true or they may be partially true. And how do we name them, excavate them, and attend to them feels very, very important. So let's see, next slide. When we are thinking about restorative justice in our communities and bringing them to our communities, the most important thing is to start, particularly in relationship to sexual violence, but in all harms that occur. But in sexual violence and intimate partner violence, we really need to be centering survivor agency and safety. We have to remember that restorative justice isn't mediation. Remember the three questions, right? Who was harmed and what do they need and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? When I think about traditional mediation models where we've got sort of two sides and we're trying to figure out how to bring everybody together in the middle, this is not about bringing people together in the middle. I don't want to be brought to the middle about some shared narrative that we can both have in which the people who've raped me, I get to like soften what I'm saying so that I'm making people comfortable. No, we're not doing any of that, right? That's not what it's about. So I'm defining the harm and I need the way in which I've defined the harm to be held and to be understood, for people to use my language in relationship to how I talk about the harms that I've experienced, et cetera. There are things that I've lived through that I call rape. There are things that I live through that I call sexual assault. I need us to attend to that in the way in which I'm defining it, right? This isn't about us coming to some compromise understanding of what it is that I've experienced. And then, naming that, my needs, the victim identified needs, the crime survivor identified needs are put at the center of restorative processes. And one of the most critical things, a shift that I had to make as a former advocate and as a former lawyer, is that we have to trust more than we do today that survivors know what will make them safe. And that people who are close to the survivor are going to be knowing way more than I do, right? Before I used to come with sort of like these things on offer. You get an order of protection and you can go to this program or that program, or you can, like, these are the things, we're going to relocate you, or this or that, the other. And I sort of would have my little list of things that I would do. And I would sort of bring my models and apply them to people. And when I came to restorative justice, it was actually quite a huge relief for me to not have to have answers to other people's situations that I actually didn't know as much about as they did, right? So I think that that's really important. to name that we have to trust that people know what they need. It doesn't mean that we support stuff that seems like incredibly deadly dangerous, right? We don't do whatever anyone says as restorative justice facilitators, but we do have to deeply, deeply listen to other people's notions of what safety, agency, healing, accountability look like for them. That's what's really beautiful about these processes. And that in that, the self and chosen supporters are quote unquote enforcers, not necessarily the state, ideally not the state at all, is the way I approach the work. And so that's another thing that I think is really important. That in and of itself, when you are being given a notion of accountability that is how long somebody else is going to be locked up, or what other state process is going to be done to the person that hurts you, that's not really centering what it is that it doesn't give me any agency as being a part of the process that is rebalancing the imbalance that happened when a harm got caused, right? So that feels important. When I say enforcers, I don't at all mean vigilantism, right? These restorative justice processes are ones that happen in deep dialogue, and again, really holding the humanity of everyone involved. This word in Maori, mana, I think best describes this idea. It's sort of your dignity and your life force and your status in the community and your sort of well-being in the community. This word mana. And I was told, I believe it was by Edie Mako, as a restorative justice facilitator in Aotearoa, a Maori woman, said that the purpose of a restorative justice process is for every single person to walk out with their dignity maintained or intact or increased. So when you're leaning into that everyone's dignity is intact or increased, if that's what we're being enforcers of, in a sense, it really takes sort of that negativity out of that word enforcer. Like, yeah, I do kind of want to help really hold that process. So, and last, on this sort of set of questions is that, again, community-based doesn't mean private, right? Restorative justice won't work without community. I often use that like social work tool of concentric spheres, like who are your closest people, and then who are the next level of people out, and then who are other people in your life who might be benefit, and really getting as many of the people who, through dialogue with the people who are directly impacted, involved in that decision-making about who should be coming into the circle. That's a huge part of what makes restorative justice effective, is to have those family and community members there. It's really important that facilitators, particularly in sexual violence cases, meet with every single person who's going to be in the circle or the conference in advance. So we have a heads up about where people are coming from, and to really be able to make sure that there's nobody coming that's not going to be coming from a place of wanting everyone's mana to be intact or increased, or wanting everyone to move forward in a good way. VOD models, victim offender dialogue models, while I see them as being really beneficial inside prison, I don't think that they have enough people in the room. It's often just like two people in a dialogue, literally, about a thing that happened many, many ages ago. And that model isn't necessarily enough people in ongoing relationships. Sometimes there's supporters in the room, but it's not really the model that I would suggest for sexual violence cases. Those mediation and dialogue models, rather circle, conferencing, other models that are really about bringing family and community in to be the holders of the space. Again, avoiding third-party decider models, which to my mind aren't really restorative justice. So a lot of people say we have a youth court and it's restorative justice, or we have like a community board and that's restorative. If there's somebody other than the survivor that is like the central person in the consensus-based process, helping determine what the outcome of this thing is, when there's a plan to repair the harm and move forward in a good way, if there's some other person deciding, for me as a survivor of sexual violence, once again, it's like somebody else deciding about my body, what happened, somebody deciding about my history, about my suffering. That doesn't feel right to me. So I would just really think about that. Hang on, just checking the chat here. I'm seeing questions coming up and I will get to those. How can restorative justice be used for youth who don't have a memory of the sexual violence? I'm going to put a pin in that. I'm going to come back to these questions as I'm seeing a couple questions starting to pop in. Okay, so thank you for your questions, and I will be getting to them shortly. So make sure I can scroll back. Yes, I can. Okay, so finally, for me, again, coming from my personal history, increased safety for survivors who are unwilling to engage state actors is really important, right? I mean, for me, I could have really used something that addressed the harm. And a very brief story from my own childhood. I left home briefly and stayed with a teacher at one point who brought me back home. And when people ask, like, what's your first experience with restorative justice? I'm like, actually, I was 14 and I left home. And then my teacher brought me back and we all sat sort of in a circle and answered this question, which was, why do we think Sujatha is leaving home? And it was through that, while the truth didn't come out, my father was in that circle, my mother was in that circle, right? And while the full truth didn't come out, when I looked at my father right in the eyes during that dialogue and I said, I don't know, Anu, I called him Anu. I don't know, Anu, why don't you tell us, why do you think I don't want to be here? And I saw fear on his face for the first time. And after that circle, you know, it wasn't the way we would do circle today, right? He never touched me again. And so I think that this is, so for me, that there was something that didn't involve calling the system was very, very important for me. So I am going to pop up in here and see if there's more. There is more Q&A happening. And I'm gonna close out this really quickly. I would just suggest, and then I'm going to move to the questions because they're starting to pour in. Okay, which tells me I've talked enough and it's time to chat with all of you.
That sounds great.
Yeah, okay. So I would check out this report called A Reasoned Approach, Reshaping Sex Offender Policy to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse. It's outdated 2011, but it really shows the failures of the current criminal legal system's approach to ending sexual violence. And I'm going to just run through these super fast, which is the standards by which we approach sexual violence, right? It's got to be voluntary. I would suggest starting your program by doing focus groups and using Circle as focus groups for asking survivors what they'd like their restorative justice program to look like in your area. It's going to take a lot more than just 40 hours of training in restorative justice and 40 hours of training and this and that and the other. That I think that it's going to have to be born out of the wisdom, both of folks who caused harm and experienced harm, the way we start to build this work. Again, it's not about neutral peace. It's not about neutrality. It's about people who are really moving forward in a good way. I think that there's some wisdom about safety planning that we can be thinking about in terms of people who are in stalking and other sort of longer term sexual violence situations. My great hope is that this not become something that's like professionalized or certified in a way, because I think that that really limits community capacity to intervene. And I think that some of the best, I think I literally have to take off my lawyer hat and my advocate hat a lot of the time to do my best work as a restorative justice facilitator. And so this uber professionalization of restorative justice will take it very far from its roots and its best work. That's my personal feeling. If we're being very, very, if we're increasing our discretion about what we'll consider for a restorative justice process, then I think it's going to lead to discrimination in certain communities. We've seen that in all kinds of programs we create. And so I would strongly suggest letting be whatever I need. And I say what else because I think the answers are going to come from people who try to do this work. That'll just close out with this quote, which is that reconciliation does not mean forgetting or trying to bury the pain of conflict, but that reconciliation means working together to correct the legacy of past injustice. And so I think we have some work to do, not just in restorative justice more broadly, but in the field and the history of the field itself, like who got pushed out of our movements to end sexual and intimate partner violence. My hope is that we might have a compassion and accountability and truth and reconciliation process inside our movement work also as a piece of the work to do. So with all that being said, I see many, many questions. And I don't know, Chelsea, would you prefer that I look to the ones that are already typed in? And then maybe what I'm going to do is ask that folks stop typing them in. If we're going to be doing live Q&A, maybe we should move to that. Or what are your thoughts, Chelsea? How's this working?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We've received several questions right now. So if folks can hold them if they haven't asked them yet, we may end up answering your questions in the process too. So we'll start with the first one that popped up, if that's okay. So that question is, how can restorative justice be used for youth who do not have a memory of the sexual violence? And is this possible without creating more trauma?
Restorative justice for youth who have a memory. So I'm curious about, well, I'm going to answer it both ways. I have a memory of the sexual violence, whether they caused it or experienced it. And I've worked with people who have had both. I don't remember because I was drunk when I did what I did. I don't remember because I'm drunk when I experienced this harm, but I know when I woke up that this is what had happened. So not just in the alcohol context. I have a friend that I'm working with who did not know that she was sexually abused until somebody in the family said, maybe some of the problems in your life are happening because you were raped as a child by this person that we are still in community with. And so getting to the point where they were in dialogue, right, involved a lot of, what are you prepared to hear? What do you want to know? Some people want to know what happened to their bodies when they were not present for it. Some people don't. Again, it is really about the survivor drives the train. The survivor is going to let us know what they want to hear, and working really closely with the person who's caused the harm to have them know, like, these kind of things are off limits. You may feel like you need to tell the person everything you did, but you can tell me, but they may not want to hear it. And so we're going to let that person drive the train, right? I always make a point of telling survivors that I can't guarantee what this person is or isn't going to do. It's really important for people to understand that they may get dysregulated and need it to pop out, right? Like, I can work as hard as I can. So, in an ideal world, I'd have like 18 months to work with each person to make sure they're really ready. I mean, that's only ideal if they're not ready to have the conversation now, right? Everything, again, is letting the directly impacted folks drive the train, with me letting people know, hey, if we do it too soon, you might hear stuff that you don't want to hear. And I won't have worked with that person long enough to make sure that they're not going to say that. Right? Or do you want to do it anyway? Do you so need to just get this out of the way that you know that this isn't going to be perfect, right? It's not going to be perfect anyway. Nothing's perfect, right? Like, these kinds of things. So that's a beautiful, beautiful question. It is possible to do so without creating more trauma. And it's always about the agency of the people directly impacted. So that's the first one.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to combine a couple of the questions because they're asking something very similar. So how can people who have caused harm participate honestly in restorative justice processes without the threat of the state's involvement hanging over them? And how do we allow for a person to change while realizing that change is not overnight without putting other people at risk of harm?
Yeah. So the first one, so if you go to we've created our work on youth diversion works in tandem with the state. Children who are arrested pre-charged without being charged with a crime, no probation officer, no lawyers, et cetera, have an opportunity to be diverted to a community-based organization with zero court involvement, right? No lawyers, no probation, none of that. And when we do that in particular jurisdictions, we got about 7 now across the nation, we're doing that. We do it with a memorandum of understanding with the district attorney. In my dream world, someday DAs will be signing these, even if they're not the ones diverting the cases, and in the intimate partner violence context. So you can go on our website, which is rjdtoolkit.org, and you can go through that whole website and learn how to start a youth diversion program. And in that toolkit, somewhere in there is an actual copy of the memorandum of understanding that you're going to want to get the DA to sign. And so work with lawyers in your area to modify that to be specific to non-direct diversion cases. I might ultimately just make one available where we would want to see people use those as a model one. We can see if I can go back and look through my stuff and see when I've done it sort of in one-off cases and getting district attorneys to sign cases saying that we understand that this community-based organization is doing restorative justice processes with intimate partner or sexual violence. We understand that survivors don't contact the system, and we want them to be safe. To that end, we promise that when this organization is doing this work, we will not subpoena anyone. We will not use any information that comes out of the restorative justice process in a court of law. We do this with a full understanding that we're actually going to be making the community safer if we let people have restorative justice processes. so this may be a pipe dream of mine, but I really want one of y'all to go out there and actually prove me right, that this is a dream come true, that there are districts, that we have progressive district attorneys across the world, nation, everywhere now, right? And I'm very curious to see if the right advocacy could exist to get DAs to understand that people will be completely, like, the most important thing that I have seen survivors of sexual violence here is, you are absolutely right. That is what I did to you. I did that to you. You deserve better than that. I lied in the beginning. I said you were making it up and you weren't, right? In the sexual violence cases I facilitated, more than anything else, like, some people wanted a little money for therapy. Some people wanted a little, like, just Snapchat back to everybody that you lied. You know, well, actually, it always comes back to, like, you lied, right? You didn't, you said you didn't do it and you did, right? And so it's hard to get that to happen with the potential threat that somebody will run around and go tell the state, the system. And so operating with these memorandum of understanding can be a great part of that. I'm sorry, I totally forgot the second half of the question that you tried so beautifully to stick together.
That's great. So how do we allow for a person to change while realizing that change doesn't happen overnight and without putting other people at risk of harm?
Right. I think it's important to understand that it takes time, and that that the current criminal legal system isn't doing anything to stop people from causing harm, right? The vast majority of cases don't result in conviction. The vast majority of cases don't end up, that's that slide I sort of breezed past, right? Of all these cases of harm, like, less than 3% end up with any kind of conviction, let alone prison time. Like, even of that teeny tiny percentage, right? So it's not like calling the cops is going to actually fix it either. For the vast majority of cases, we know that about child sexual abuse. It's really bad stats on sexual violence broadly. And so I don't know what our alternative is, but to start to help people be accountable for the harms that they've caused. That feels really important, to know that it's not like, we can't hold ourselves up against the standard of perfection. We're not going to get there. It's about I'm a harm reduction kind of person. I'm like, in all these cases where we try to make efforts towards a world in which people have an opportunity to change and be accountable, that is an opportunity that wasn't there when nobody was going to call the police in the first place in that particular situation, and nothing else is really on offer, right? So that's sort of the way I take it on. That sounds not satisfying. I understand that it is deeply unsatisfying answer. It's better than nothing, which is what's usually happening right now. When I think about several of the sexual harms that I've experienced, nothing happened, nothing. So, you know, and surely nothing would have happened if we went the criminal legal system route. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. To kind of ask a follow-up question, have you, in your experience, had cases where you were facilitating with someone who repeatedly had done harm and who might have known the right things to say and then continued to do harm?
It's a beautiful question. How
did you handle that? Okay.
I have not personally facilitated. That's not true. There's one case where I felt like the person, there's one case that went really badly and the person just sort of got away with it, right? And I had a long conversation with the person who experienced the harm about whether or not she still just wanted the dialogue anyway. And it was the one time that I really erred. And I think it's a part of why they both wanted nobody else in the room, and I acquiesced to that. And so I remain the only witness to this person gaslighting the other person and not taking responsibility. And I feel bad about it to this day. What I know is that she said afterwards that she still is glad that she got to say her thing to him. It's really problematic. And so there will be times when restorative justice fails, right? If we have a criminal legal system with its huge recidivism rates and its huge failure rates on all fronts, restorative justice is not going to be perfect. And so that is one really unfortunate case that I was involved in. And there's another case where I think that there's a person who still, I mean, I've been sort of involved in an ongoing way in a situation where I don't think the person has yet to fully understand their patriarchal attitudes. And I think that that also comes from that person's inability to unpack the harms that they lived with and witnessed and experienced, and how the patriarchy was really damaging to him. And so some of these things are an ongoing process against harm reduction. They remain in relationship, these folks, and I think that they, I know that the person who I think is on the receiving end of a lot of these negative ways of seeing relationships is certainly not experiencing sexual violence anymore. It's not a relationship. This is the thing. The standard is it's not a relationship that I would personally be in, but that can't be the standard. Like as a facilitator, I don't set the standard for what's a healthy relationship. And so I see them on a journey, that particular couple.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I've got several other questions. One is, have you engaged in restorative justice processes between an individual and a state agency or an individual who works for the state?
Nope.
Okay. Do you think this would look different, like for an incarcerated person, for example?
Oh, wait, an incarcerated person.
I have a suspicion this is what's being asked.
I'm sure. So there's this notion of like when the person who's experienced harm is being is an incarcerated person who is harmed by like a correctional officer. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. So I struggle with. I think it would have to look incredibly different. I mean, the power differentials are insane there, right? So it's sort of like, how do we mitigate that? That's really challenging. And I think that that's the case every time there's a severe power differential, that the circle needs to hold all the things, including this huge power imbalance in its construction, right? Like, how do we set this up in a way that attends to the fact that there's a radical power differential? Restorative justice is not the great equalizer. Passing a talking piece through every set of hands doesn't mean that everybody's going to speak, because the power is still in the room. And so I will just say that I have shied away from this or have not engaged in it because I worry that, particularly with state actors, that we're not going to get there until we have like a national truth and reconciliation around race and genocide and all of the other things, right? Until we have a deeper understanding of the fact that the state can and does cause harm on a regular basis, that we're not going to, not just historically, but in present day, I don't think we're going to. I think it's going to need a lot more work. And so I tend to operate more on the community-based level myself. So I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that question.
That's a great answer. Thank you. So I've got another kind of twofold question. What credentials, if any, should RJ facilitators have, and where can people learn more about getting involved?
So I both struggle with credentialing, but don't do this without having training. Like it's, and then that it depends, like, is there an alternative to training? So I did this survey once for the Office of Victims of Crime, and we never published it for a variety of reasons, and maybe hope to get some of that information out someday to the world. But one of the most powerful things in this national survey of then, maybe it was like 8 years ago, 6 years ago, 900 organizations that say they do restorative justice, not in the intimate partner or sexual violence context, but in all contexts. And when I asked this question around training and credentialing, a couple different indigenous tribes wrote back saying, training is for pets. We don't train. And I'm still embarrassed and humbled by the response to that question. And so that is beautiful. And so if you're steeped in the values of restorative justice, right? I also heard a story from Cheryl Graves, who used to offer certificates in restorative justice, for the restorative justice trainings in Chicago for the Community Justice for Youth Institute, amazing organization to offer circle trainings. And they stopped certificating because there was an indigenous woman who was denied a job, who had grown up doing circle her whole life, denied a job at the local school district because she didn't have a certificate like the other applicants did, even though she was the best candidate in all other fronts. So that's why I don't believe it. That story in and of itself is when I stopped giving certificates. And to my mind, credentialed by whom? Again, I don't trust I don't trust the state to credential folks. I think that it's going to play itself out until, again, we resolve our really high levels of not just our high levels of racial and ethnic disparities, but also the bias towards criminalization that exists with the state, right? I mean, this is the way in which we address sexual harm through state actors, right? And so, for the most part, it's through notions of separation and containment, and that's not what restorative justice is. So, who's going to be credentialing? I think comes up with the first question, but I think it's an important question. To ask what are the qualifications for doing this, right? At the same time, I'm like, don't run off and do this until you know what you're doing, right? And so I myself have gone through, I don't even know how many trainings. Victim offender dialogue in crimes of severe violence with the Lorraine Stutzman Amstutz is one of the best trainings I have ever received. Taught me so much about how to talk to crime survivors and help identify their needs and prepare them for all the things that might happen in a restorative justice process. Also really a great training on how to help people be accountable. Again, I don't generally work in VOD models, but the benefits from that training were amazing. Defense victim outreach was another training that I did. I think I've done that training twice, just incredible. I've done the VOD training at least twice, 3 times. Circle process, I probably sat through like 4 or 5 circle trainings. I keep going back for training. Even as I've started offering trainings, I still kept going to trainings. Another model, family group conferencing, a few different ways in which we can think about family group conferencing in child protective services in relationship to Gail Buford and Joan Pinnell have taught me a lot on different ways about thinking about family group conferencing in the notion of child welfare contexts and learnings that I've gained there. So lots and lots and lots of trainings. I go to lots of trainings. And then at the same time, I was a victim advocate for a while. I've done rape crisis trainings. I've been a rape crisis counselor for a long time, right? I worked in shelters. So these are the kinds of things that I think collectively, I feel qualify me to do this work. There are still cases that a lot of self-assessment, like, am I the right person to do this case? I think a lot about, this is like a totally unrelated thing, but environmental, the damage that we're doing to our mother, the earth. And I am too triggered, and I am too, it's not even triggered is the wrong word. Like, I literally just want to fall out on the floor and like I could never be the keeper about a thing that involved like environmental damage by like a corporation to a community, toxic dumping stuff, whatever. I would never hold that case because I don't have the knowledge, and I have like deep personal hangups. Or hang-up is the wrong word. Sorry, I'm losing my words today, but it's just I'm deeply impacted in a way that makes me not able to hold my seat. And so what will help you do that? What will help you stay in that equal partiality place? That's an issue I can't touch. So I think it's about knowing ourselves really well. Maybe you can do some kinds of sexual harm and not other kinds of sexual harm. And that's, I think, an incredibly important part of the process.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got a few minutes left. There's another question in the Q&A box that I'd like to get to, asking, what are your thoughts on implementing RJ practices on college campuses? What do you think? Yeah,
I think it's a really possible thing. I am so that the whole recharacterization, the reworking of Title IX is deeply, deeply problematic on the one hand, and on the other might open a window in some ways to doing restorative justice because it is slightly less punitive, right? That's a mess, right? Like when the state might be getting it right for all the wrong reasons, right? Is a thing that happens a lot in the context of addressing sexual harm through restorative justice. So let me explain. One time I talked to a DA who was willing to hand me a stack of cases because he was like, this shouldn't even be charged. This is just like boys will be boys. Yay. So I try to not do restorative justice in relationship to the state in any way that net widens. And on the other hand, I was like, thank you, I will take those cases. Because in looking through them, I was like, that's some really serious sexual harm that happened in those cases, right? And so how do we hold the fact that the state exists and the state is going to do what it's going to do. And when the state makes mistakes sometimes or does things for the wrong reasons, that still might be opening the door to healing processes. And again, it's always about things being driven by the survivor, right? So if this is something that the survivor wants to do, then I'm down for it. If it seems like it's something that's going to be beneficial, or even if the person who's caused harm wants to do something and the survivor ends up being amenable. I think you have to be really, really careful about non-survivor initiated restorative justice processes, particularly in the context of sexual harm. Even initiating a restorative justice process could re-traumatize a person. And so it's really important to do it in a way that is holding the well-being of the survivor in our hearts when we're moving forward. But college campuses are inherently communities, ideally. And so I think that it's a great context for doing sexual violence. I am, again, skeptical of third-party deciders. I don't like boards. I don't like it being tied up with pre-existing judicial or judicial-light processes. I don't think that those are the best models in general, and I think they're particularly bad models when it comes to to re-empowering people who are disempowered by sexual violence. There's nothing worse. I can't imagine anything more gaslighting than cross-examination or having my version of things questioned, and that is. So if anything starts to smell like that in the restorative justice context and the restorative justice processes that people are involved in, like that's not beneficial. I see another question in the chat box here that I might jump to if we still have a minute.
Yeah, we've got some time.
Okay. So, sure. Yeah, this is a really interesting thing. This came up a lot around the being asked to comment on Brock Turner. Mm-hmm. I struggle with whether or not restorative processes are ever, it's hard to talk about cases when the table has already been set by the criminal legal system and by school expulsion processes, et cetera. It's really hard to know. I can't guess what Brock Turner might have done or who he might have been. I see literally the worst levels of that didn't happen and you're all lying. As a former criminal defense attorney, I have had clients who, initially were like, absolutely, I'm absolutely innocent. They got the wrong guy. It wasn't me. Right? And then years and years later, needing to reach out to me, being like, I can't carry the guilt anymore, right? And I think that it's interesting that, like, what if we had from jump approached that person being like, you did something really bad, right? I want to know you and help you make this right. I really care about you. And here are all the people who love you so much and want you to be your best self and are going to be here for you while you make this right. But you are going to make this right, right? Like, and that our relationship would not start with, one of the questions that I was once coached in one of my public defender jobs to ask, because I was getting like too close to my clients, was the critique of my lawyering, and that I was told to stop asking what happened and to start asking, okay, don't tell me what happened. Tell me what they're going to be able to prove you did. And, so when we're approaching people who've caused harm from the perspective of, like, I know you didn't do this, and let's figure out how to win this case. Oh my goodness, like, how are we ever going to get to the truth, right? And I think about this with the Miranda warnings all the time, right? Asking somebody to tell us what happened after you've just said anything you say can and will be held against you in a court of law. Like, who's going to tell the truth? Like, nobody. If I say to my son, hey, baby, did you break this? Did you use this and break this after I told you not to touch it? If you did, I'm going to lock you in your room for the next God knows how long, right? He's going to be like, no, Amma, I didn't do that. Right? I mean, I would have expected that of him when he was younger, right? But if I say, hey, baby, I asked you not to touch this and you did and you broke it, like, can we sit down and talk about what was going on with you when you did that and what you and I can do together to work together to make this right? Right? You gotta fix this by Emma. I don't want you to see that for the rest of your life in this house, my broken favorite thing, and just always feel guilty about it. And I actually feel some mistrust of you now. So can we work together to do this in a good way? and if I tell him that, my son immediately says, yes, I did that. Can we fix it? Right. And so I don't see that it's different with the criminal legal system. I'm not saying that everybody's going to be like that. I'm not saying it's 100% of people are going to respond so positively. I think sometimes we have deeply embedded reasons for not being able to take responsibility. But the shame and the punishment that comes with our current legal systems, and also, I'm going to say it, our call out culture is really going to minimize the possibilities of us actually being able to say the things that we do. In the end, every time I cause harm, I want to be accountable, and I want to be unconditionally loved in order to be accountable. And you can say, oh, that's just you. But I will tell you that I have had that experience of people who have raped multiple people who have sexually abused children. I have had conversations with folks who say, in the end, I want to be seen. I want to actually confess what I did. You know, the vast majority of our cases in the criminal legal system result in plea deals, in part because people are being railroaded, and because our system just railroads people into pleas, but in part it's because people confess, like people want to say what they did. And I don't know, you know, there's so much shame and secrecy and silence around sexual violence. I think a huge part of whether you've experienced it or caused it, and I think a huge part of our work to make restorative justice available in sexual violence is for us to stop with the shaming and the punishment that comes along with it. So that's my thinking. It is hard to know what would have happened with Brock. It's hard to know whether or not, you know, a lifetime of entitlement would have made him particularly not responsive in a timely fashion to opportunities to repair the harm in a good way. It's really hard to know. But I hold out a hope for everyone, for Brock, for everybody. I hold out a hope for everybody.
Yeah, thank you. We are at 2 minutes past, so we've hit time. Do you have anything that you've been thinking about, Sujatha, that you would like to share before we go?
You know, I just want to, I would just close with saying, this is a dream come true that we're even having these conversations. I left the work to end sexual and intimate partner violence in my 20s and became a defense attorney, initially because Sue Ostoff, I'm so grateful that she existed. Mm-hmm. The National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women existed, and it was a place where I could have real conversations about, I forgave my father for sexually abusing me, but he also needed to be accountable. And like, there was just nowhere it was safe to have those conversations. I was pathologized. I was told I had Stockholm syndrome. I was told by therapists that I over-identified with my Indian culture, and that I needed to understand how to individuate better and to assimilate to American culture. Like, these are the things that happened when I was trying to grapple with what would it have looked like for us to have done that incredible opportunity to have said, to look to my father in the eyes before he passed away and said, you know, why do you think I'm running away? Why do you think I'm leaving home? For that to have been something more than that, the fact that I get to witness that from time to time and that I get to help people try to build those opportunities. This is literally a dream come true. For those of you who are opening your hearts in some small way to this process, for those of you who are willing to bring your wisdom from the movement work that you've done, from the ending sexual violence work that you've done, from the advocacy work that you've done, to these questions and this very nascent moment, just something that many of us have been doing sort of off the grid for years, but are really starting to talk about it more publicly. It is an incredible blessing for me. It heals me to have these conversations. And so I just want to thank you all for listening in today. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Sujatha, for sharing your time, your expertise, and drawing on the folks that you've learned from as well. And thank you to everybody who's participated today as well. We really greatly appreciate it. When you close out of the webinar, you'll be brought to a survey. So please complete your evaluation. It'll help us plan future webinars, trainings, and other content that you might be looking for. Thank you, everyone. And there is a link to a song for you, Sujatha, in the chat.
Thank you, Daniel, for sending me a link to a song. I could use a song after this. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll be closing out in just a moment. All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.